Sometimes the greatest lessons come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Sometimes pride costs more than money, and wisdom arrives on 4 dusty hooves when you least expect it. In 1887, Nevada, cattle baron Thomas Beckett measured worth by appearance and power by possession. When he paid $50,000 for a magnificent Spanish war stallion to outshine his rivals, he expected greatness to arrive at his ranch. Instead, a scruffy little donkey with lopsided ears stepped off that wagon, and Beckett's world turned upside down. What the old Mexican courier told him would haunt Beckett for months. What you wanted was strength. What you got is stronger. But how could something so small and humble teach a proud man about true strength? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun crested over the Silver Creek Mountains, casting long shadows across the Thomas Beckett Ranch, 15,000 acres of prime Nevada rangeland that stretched as far as the eye could see. From his study window on the second floor of the grand adobe house, Thomas Beckett stood with his coffee, surveying his domain like a general overlooking a battlefield he had conquered through sheer will and relentless ambition. At 45, Beckett possessed the weathered hands of a man who had worked his way up from nothing, but the refined bearing of someone who had earned the right to command respect. His dark hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was always perfectly groomed, and his mustache was trimmed with military precision. Even at this early hour he wore a pressed white shirt and vest, his boots polished to a mirror shine. Everything about Thomas Beckett spoke of control, success, and uncompromising standards. Below, in the corrals, his pride and joy awaited the morning inspection, his collection of prize stallions. 12 magnificent horses, each one a testament to Beckett's discerning eye and deep pockets. There was Thunderbolt, the massive black Frisian whose flowing mane caught the wind like silk banners. Beside him stood Conquistador, the chestnut Arabian whose bloodline traced back to the stables of Spanish royalty. The magnificent Appaloosa, Stormcloud, paced restlessly in his paddock, his spotted coat gleaming like polished marble. Each horse represented more than breeding and beauty. They were living symbols of Beckett's triumph over circumstance. He had started with nothing more than calloused hands and an iron determination to rise above the poverty that had defined his childhood. Now men traveled from as far as California just to admire his horses, and rival ranchers spoke his name with grudging respect tinged with envy. "Morning, Mr. Beckett," called Miguel Santos, his head foreman, approaching from the direction of the stables. Miguel had worked for Beckett for 8 years, ever since Thomas had expanded the ranch into horse breeding. A compact man with graying hair and intelligent eyes, Miguel understood horses almost as well as he understood his employer's obsession with them. "How are they looking today, Miguel?" Beckett asked, though he could see for himself that his animals were in perfect condition. It was a ritual question, part of the daily routine that kept his world ordered and predictable. Thunderbolts favoring his left front leg just slightly. "Nothing serious, but I'll have Doc Morrison take a look when he comes through town next week. Conquistador threw a shoe yesterday, but Carlos reset it perfectly. The mare, Dancing Star, she's coming into season, so we'll need to keep the stallions separated for a few days." Beckett nodded, appreciating the thoroughness of the report. He had learned long ago that success lay in attending to details, in knowing exactly what was happening on every acre of his land. It was this attention to detail that had transformed him from a broke ranch hand into one of the most successful cattle barons in Nevada. The sound of approaching hooves drew their attention to the main road. A dust cloud announced the arrival of Jacob Morrison, no relation to the veterinarian who owned the neighboring Rocking M Ranch. Morrison was Beckett's closest competitor and his most persistent rival. Where Beckett had built his fortune through careful planning and smart investments, Morrison had inherited his wealth and lands from his father. A fact that never failed to irritate Beckett. Morrison rode up on his own prize stallion, a magnificent Palomino, named Golden Thunder. At 38, Morrison was 7 years younger than Beckett, with the easy confidence of a man who had never known want. His blonde hair and blue eyes gave him an almost boyish appearance that women found charming and men found either endearing or insufferable, depending on their perspective. "Morning, Thomas," Morrison called out, dismounting with practiced ease. "Heard through the grapevine that you've been making some inquiries about Spanish horses." Beckett felt his jaw tighten slightly. In the small community of serious horse breeders, news traveled fast, and Morrison had an uncanny ability to learn about Beckett's business almost as quickly as Beckett himself made decisions. "I'm always looking to improve my stock," Beckett replied carefully. "A man who stops learning starts dying." Morrison laughed, a sound that carried just a hint of condescension. "That's admirable, Thomas, truly. Though I have to wonder what you could possibly add to this collection that would make it any more impressive." He gestured toward the corrals where Beckett's stallions grazed in the morning sun. There it was, the subtle challenge, the implication that Beckett had reached the limits of what money could buy. Morrison had a talent for finding exactly the right words to needle his neighbor's pride without crossing into outright insult. "There's always room for improvement," Beckett said evenly. "The Spanish are breeding war horses again, descendants of the animals that carried conquistadors across 2 continents. Horses bred for courage, endurance, and spirit that goes beyond what most people can imagine." Morrison's eyes lit up with interest and something else, competitive fire. "Spanish war horses. That sounds expensive, even for someone with your resources." Beckett felt the familiar surge of competitive energy that had driven him to accumulate wealth and status throughout his adult life. Cost is never the primary consideration when acquiring something truly exceptional. "Of course not," Morrison agreed, "though I imagine even you might balk at paying more for a single horse than most men make in a lifetime." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Maria Gonzalez, Beckett's cook and housekeeper, ringing the bell that called the ranch hands to breakfast. Maria had worked for Beckett for 6 years, ever since her husband had died in a mining accident. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with kind eyes and the sort of quiet wisdom that came from raising 7 children and burying 2 husbands. Where Miguel managed Beckett's horses and land, Maria managed his household with the same efficient competence. "Buenos dias, Senor Morrison," she called out. "Will you be staying for breakfast?" Morrison shook his head. "Thank you, Maria, but I need to get back. We're moving cattle to the upper pastures today." He turned back to Beckett. "Thomas, I hope you'll keep me informed about these Spanish horses. I'd hate for either of us to find ourselves bidding against each other without knowing it." After Morrison rode away, Beckett remained standing in the courtyard, his mind working through possibilities and calculations. The conversation had crystallized something that had been building in his thoughts for weeks. He needed something that would definitively establish his supremacy in the world of horse breeding, something so magnificent that even Morrison would be forced to acknowledge Beckett's superior judgment and resources. That afternoon, Beckett rode into the town of Silver Creek, a dusty collection of wooden buildings that served the surrounding ranches and mining operations. The town wasn't much to look at: a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and a handful of other businesses. But it was the hub of communication for the entire region. If a man wanted to send a telegram or receive mail from distant places, Silver Creek was where he came. The telegraph office occupied a corner of the general store, operated by a thin, nervous man named Henry Walsh, who had an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone's business, despite his attempts to appear discreet. Beckett composed his message carefully, addressing it to a horse dealer in San Francisco who specialized in unusual and expensive animals. "Seeking Spanish warhorse bloodlines. Cost no object for exceptional animal. Require impressive size, perfect conformation, documented lineage. Will pay premium for exclusive access to finest available. Reply immediately with details and price." As he handed over the message and the money for transmission, Beckett felt the familiar thrill of a calculated risk. This was how he had built his fortune, by going after opportunities that other men considered too expensive or too uncertain. When everyone else had said cattle ranching couldn't succeed in this part of Nevada, he had proven them wrong. When they said the land was too dry to support large herds, he had drilled wells and built irrigation systems. When they said he was paying too much for prize horses, his animals had won competitions and commanded breeding fees that made his investments profitable. 3 days later, the reply came. The San Francisco dealer had located what he described as the finest Spanish war stallion currently available in North America. The horse was descended from animals bred for the Spanish cavalry, with bloodlines that could be traced back 3 centuries. The price was $50,000, more than many successful ranchers made in 5 years. Beckett read the telegram twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his vest pocket. $50,000 was a substantial sum, even for a man of his means. But the horse would represent more than an investment. It would be a declaration that Thomas Beckett had reached a level of success that few men could match. That evening, as he sat in his study reviewing the ranch's financial records, Beckett calculated the impact of such a purchase. The money was available, barely, but it would require liquidating some investments and delaying planned improvements to the ranch's infrastructure. The practical part of his mind whispered warnings about the wisdom of spending so much on a single animal, no matter how magnificent, but the part of his mind that had driven him from poverty to prosperity whispered something else entirely. This was his chance to own something truly unique, to possess an animal that would silence all questions about his status and judgment. When Jacob Morrison saw this Spanish war stallion, when the other ranchers and breeders came to admire the latest addition to the Beckett collection, there would be no doubt about who had the finest horses in Nevada. The next morning, Beckett sent his reply, "Purchase authorized. Arrange immediate shipping to Silver Creek, Nevada. Payment upon delivery." As he watched Henry Walsh tap out the message, Beckett felt a familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension. In a few weeks, the finest horse money could buy would arrive at his ranch, and Thomas Beckett would own something that no other man in the territory could claim. He had no way of knowing that the universe was preparing to teach him a lesson about the difference between what a man wants and what he truly needs. 3 weeks later, the day of the great arrival dawned clear and bright. Beckett had spent the previous evening preparing for what he expected to be one of the finest moments in his ranching career. The special paddock had been freshly painted, the finest oats imported from California, and a custom-made leather halter, crafted by the territory's best saddle-maker, awaited the Spanish war stallion. Word had spread throughout the region about Beckett's extraordinary purchase. By 10 o'clock in the morning, a small crowd had gathered at the ranch. Neighbors, fellow ranchers, townspeople, and even Jacob Morrison, who claimed he was just passing by, but had clearly timed his visit to coincide with the delivery. $50,000, Morrison said to anyone who would listen, shaking his head in apparent amazement. "That's more than I paid for my first 1,000 acres. Beckett tried to maintain his composure, but inside he felt the familiar mixture of pride and anxiety that accompanied any significant gamble. He had staked not just money, but his reputation on this purchase. The telegram from San Francisco had been brief but promising. Exceptional animal departed as scheduled. Prepare for magnificence. Miguel stood beside him, equally anxious. "Senor Beckett, perhaps we should move the crowd back a little. This horse, if he is as spirited as you expect, he might need space to adjust to his new surroundings." It was good advice, but Beckett wanted the audience close enough to appreciate every detail of his acquisition. He had worked too hard and spent too much to hide the results of his investment. At precisely 11 o'clock, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon, moving slowly along the main road. Beckett felt his heart rate increase as the cloud grew larger and more distinct. Soon, the outline of a wagon became visible, pulled by 2 sturdy mules and driven by a figure in a wide-brimmed hat. "Here it comes," someone in the crowd whispered, and an expectant hush fell over the gathering. As the wagon drew closer, Beckett frowned. He had expected something more impressive, perhaps a specially designed transport with multiple handlers and obvious precautions for a valuable animal. Instead, he saw a simple freight wagon, dusty from travel, with what appeared to be a single elderly driver. The wagon pulled into the ranch yard and stopped directly in front of the assembled crowd. The driver was indeed elderly, a Mexican man with weathered features and penetrating dark eyes. He wore simple work clothes and moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had spent decades handling difficult animals and difficult situations. "Senor Beckett?" the man asked in accented English. "Yes, I'm Thomas Beckett. You have my horse?" The old man nodded slowly and reached into his vest, producing a folded document. "I have your delivery, senor, as contracted and paid for." Beckett accepted the papers with eager hands, barely glancing at the official-looking contract before looking toward the back of the wagon. A canvas tarp covered whatever cargo the wagon carried. The crowd pressed closer, their excitement palpable. "Well," Morrison called out, "let's see this $50,000 miracle." The courier moved to the back of the wagon with maddening deliberation. He untied the corner ropes one by one, then pulled back the canvas tarp with a flourish worthy of a magician revealing his greatest trick. What stepped out of that wagon was not a magnificent Spanish war stallion. It was not even a horse. A small grey donkey with disproportionately large ears and intelligent brown eyes looked around the crowd with what could only be described as mild curiosity. The animal was clean but unremarkable, perhaps 12 hands high, with a shaggy coat that had seen better grooming and a general air of practical sturdiness. Rather than aristocratic breeding, the silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds before it was broken by a sound that Beckett would remember for the rest of his life. Jacob Morrison's delighted laughter. $50,000! Morrison gasped between fits of laughter. "Thomas, you magnificent bastard! You've been taken for the ride of a lifetime!" The crowd erupted. Some people laughed outright, others whispered among themselves, and a few looked genuinely embarrassed for Beckett. But Thomas Beckett himself stood frozen, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were showing him. "There has been a mistake," he said, his voice strangely calm. "This is not what I ordered." The courier retrieved the contract from Beckett's hands and unfolded it carefully. "Senor, the contract is very specific. One Spanish animal, descendant of war stock, bred for strength and endurance. Gispa here comes from a line of Andalusian pack donkeys that carried supplies for the Spanish army across the mountains of Mexico. Very rare bloodline, very strong. This is a donkey." Beckett's voice rose despite his efforts to maintain control. "Si, senor. A very special donkey. I ordered a horse. A stallion. A war horse." The old man studied the contract again, his expression patient but uncompromising. "The contract says Spanish animal of war stock. It does not specify horse. Chispa, he is Spanish. His ancestors carried ammunition and supplies for Spanish soldiers. Much more useful than horses for many things." Morrison had recovered enough from his laughter to interject. "Thomas, surely you read the contract before you signed it." Beckett snatched the document back and read it for the first time with genuine attention. To his growing horror, he realized that the wording was indeed ambiguous. The contract mentioned Spanish bloodlines, war heritage, and exceptional strength and endurance, but nowhere did it specifically use the word horse. "This is fraud," Beckett said. But even as he spoke, he realized how weak the accusation sounded. "No fraud." "Senor," the courier replied calmly, "everything promised, everything delivered. Chispa is strong, intelligent, and from the finest bloodlines. His grandfather carried supplies to the top of mountains where horses could not go. His grandmother worked for 25 years without missing a day. You wanted strength. This is strength. I want my money back. Contract says no returns, senor. All sales final." Beckett looked around the crowd, seeing the mixture of amusement and pity in their faces. This was worse than any business failure or personal setback he had ever experienced. This was public humiliation on a scale that would be talked about for years. "Surely we can work something out," he said, his voice taking on a note of desperation. "I'll pay you to take it back." "I'll pay for your time and trouble." The old courier shook his head. "Chispa has been delivered to his new home. This is where he belongs now. I don't want a donkey. I have no use for a donkey." For the first time, the courier's expression showed something other than polite patience. His dark eyes grew stern, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that made the entire crowd fall silent. "Senor Beckett, you are a successful man. You have much land, many cattle, beautiful horses, but you do not yet know the difference between what you want and what you need. Chispa will teach you this difference, if you are wise enough to learn." The old man climbed back onto his wagon and gathered the reins. "What you wanted was strength," he called back as the mules began to move. "What you got is stronger." As the wagon disappeared down the road, Beckett stood in his ranch yard, surrounded by neighbors and rivals, staring at a $50,000 donkey. The animal, Chispa, regarded him with what seemed like sympathetic understanding, as if the donkey comprehended the magnitude of his new owner's embarrassment. The crowd began to disperse, most people having the grace to avoid making additional comments, though Beckett could hear whispered conversations and suppressed laughter as they walked away. Morrison was the last to leave, and he paused beside Beckett with an expression that managed to combine genuine sympathy with poorly concealed amusement. "Thomas," he said quietly, "for what it's worth, that's the most expensive donkey in the history of Nevada. That ought to count for something." As the dust settled and the last visitor departed, Beckett found himself alone with Miguel, Maria, and Chispa. The donkey had wandered over to investigate the water trough, apparently unconcerned with the drama surrounding his arrival. "What do we do with him, senor?" Miguel asked gently. Beckett stared at the animal that had just cost him $50,000 and a significant portion of his dignity. He had no idea what to do with a donkey, expensive or otherwise. But one thing was certain. He was stuck with Chispa, at least until he could figure out a way to salvage something from this disaster. "Put him in the small paddock behind the barn," Beckett said finally, "away from the other animals." "And Miguel?" Not a word about this to anyone else. But even as he spoke, Beckett knew it was too late for secrecy. By evening, the story of Thomas Beckett's $50,000 donkey would be the biggest news to hit Silver Creek in years. The first week with Chispa proved to be an education in humility that Thomas Beckett had never requested and certainly didn't want. Every morning, he would step onto his porch with his coffee and look toward the small paddock behind the barn, hoping against reason that the donkey might have somehow vanished during the night. Every morning, Chispa would be standing there, ears alert and eyes bright, as if he were perfectly content with his new surroundings. Beckett had installed Chispa in the most remote corner of the ranch, hoping to minimize the chances of unexpected visitors discovering his embarrassing acquisition. The paddock was serviceable but hardly elegant, a simple rope halter hung on the fence post, a stark contrast to the ornate leather bridles with silver conchos that adorned his prize stallion's stalls. "Senor Beckett," Miguel approached on the third morning, his expression carefully neutral. "The little donkey, he does not like to be alone. He calls to the horses all night, it was true." Chispa had spent the previous 3 nights braying loudly, a sound that carried across the entire ranch and announced his presence to anyone within a mile radius. The horses had responded with increasingly agitated whinnying, creating a nocturnal symphony that kept everyone awake. "Move him farther away," Beckett ordered curtly. "Senor, with respect, the farther paddock has no water source, and the fence needs repair. Perhaps if we moved him closer to the other animals?" "Absolutely not." The thought of his expensive, purebred horses being contaminated by association with a common donkey was intolerable. "Fix the fence and run a water line." Miguel nodded, but Beckett could see the doubt in his foreman's eyes. The man had worked with animals his entire life, and his instincts were usually sound. But this situation was beyond normal ranch operations. This was about salvaging what remained of Beckett's pride. The effort to isolate Chispa proved futile within days. The donkey, it turned out, possessed both intelligence and determination in remarkable quantities. On the fourth night, he somehow opened the gate latch and wandered into the main barn area, where Beckett found him the next morning contentedly sharing hay with Thunderbolt, the valuable Frisian stallion. How did he get out? Beckett demanded, though the evidence was clear enough. The latch was simple but supposedly donkey-proof, an assumption that had proven dramatically wrong. Carlos, the youngest ranch hand, couldn't suppress a grin. He watched Miguel open it yesterday, senor. Watched real careful. Then he did the same thing, just used his nose instead of hands. Beckett stared at Chispa, who returned his gaze with what seemed like mild amusement. The donkey's intelligence was becoming impossible to ignore, though Beckett wasn't sure whether this made the situation better or worse. "Install a proper lock," he ordered, "and check all the other gates. If this animal can open one latch, he can probably open others." Over the following days, Chispa proved that assessment correct. He opened the feed room door, untied rope knots with his teeth, and somehow managed to remove boards from his fence when he wanted access to better grass. Each escape required additional security measures, and each security measure seemed to only provide Chispa with a new puzzle to solve. The ranch hand's reactions to the donkey varied considerably. Carlos and the younger men found Chispa's antics entertaining, while the older hands maintained a respectful silence around Beckett regarding the animal. But it was Maria who surprised everyone with her response to the newest member of the ranch family. "He has good eyes," she told Beckett one afternoon as they watched Chispa investigate a broken water pump. "Intelligent eyes. Patient eyes." Beckett looked at the woman who had become indispensable to his household operations. Maria's judgment about people and animals was usually reliable, but in this case he suspected her sympathy was misplaced. "He's a $50,000 mistake," Beckett replied. "Intelligence doesn't make up for the fact that he's not what I ordered." Maria studied Chispa thoughtfully. "Sometimes God gives us what we need instead of what we want. The trick is being wise enough to recognize the difference." The comment echoed the old courier's words uncomfortably, and Beckett changed the subject. His attempts to train Chispa like a horse proved equally frustrating. The donkey was perfectly willing to wear a halter and lead rope, but he had his own opinions about direction, speed, and destination. If Beckett wanted to go east, Chispa would consider west. If the plan was to walk, Chispa might prefer to stand still and contemplate the scenery. "He's stubborn as a mule," Beckett complained to Miguel after a particularly frustrating training session. "Senor, he is half mule," Miguel pointed out diplomatically. "But he is not stupid. When he stops, there is usually a reason. Yesterday, when he would not cross the creek, I thought he was being difficult. Then I saw the rattlesnake on the other side." That gave Beckett pause. He had been so focused on Chispa's apparent disobedience that he hadn't considered the possibility that the animal might be making intelligent decisions based on information unavailable to humans. The theory gained support over the following week. Chispa refused to enter the old shed behind the blacksmith shop, and 2 days later Miguel discovered that the roof had been weakened by termites and was on the verge of collapse. The donkey consistently avoided certain areas of pasture that looked perfectly good to human eyes, until a thunderstorm revealed that those spots were prone to flash flooding. Most surprising of all, Chispa showed a marked preference for the working areas of the ranch over the show paddocks. While Beckett's prize stallions grazed in manicured pastures designed to display their beauty, Chispa gravitated toward the practical spaces, the blacksmith shop, the equipment barn, the areas where actual ranch work happened. "He likes to watch the men work," Carlos observed. "Yesterday, when we were fixing the windmill, he stood there the whole time, paying attention to everything. When Juan dropped his wrench, Chispa picked it up and handed it back to him." "Donkeys don't hand things to people," Beckett said automatically. "This one does, senor. You should see for yourself." Against his better judgment, Beckett found himself observing Chispa more carefully over the following days. The donkey did indeed seem to understand the rhythms and purposes of ranch work in a way that went beyond simple animal instinct. When the men were herding cattle, Chispa positioned himself where he could watch the operation without interfering. When they were repairing fences, he followed along at a respectful distance, sometimes alerting them to problems they might have missed, more disturbing. From Beckett's perspective was the growing affection the ranch hands showed for the animal. They had begun bringing him treats, scratching his ears, and talking to him as if he understood every word. Chispa, for his part, seemed to enjoy the attention, and responded with what could only be described as individual recognition. He greeted each person differently, as if he had taken the time to learn their personalities and preferences. The simple rope halter that hung by Chispa's paddock had become almost a symbol of the gulf between Beckett's expectations and reality. Where he had envisioned elaborate tack worthy of a champion stallion, he had instead the most basic equipment for the most humble of animals. Yet somehow that simple halter seemed to fit Chispa perfectly, practical, unpretentious, and entirely adequate for the work at hand. 2 weeks after Chispa's arrival, Beckett stood at his study window, watching the donkey interact with the ranch hands during their afternoon break. The animal moved among the men with easy confidence, accepting their attention but never demanding it, alert to their moods and responsive to their needs. For the first time since the disaster of delivery day, Beckett found himself wondering if there might be more to this situation than met the eye. He still didn't want a donkey, and he certainly didn't want to have paid $50,000 for one. But he was beginning to suspect that Chispa might be something more than the simple mistake he had first appeared to be. The first real test of Chispa's abilities came during the 3rd week, when a section of cattle wandered into Devil's Canyon, a narrow ravine that cut deep into the eastern boundary of Beckett's land. The canyon was notorious for its treacherous footing and tight passages, places where horses could barely squeeze through. "Let alone maneuver safely, we'll have to go in on foot," Miguel told Beckett as they surveyed the situation from the canyon rim. "The horses, they cannot make those turns safely with riders." Beckett studied the problem through his field glasses. 15 head of cattle had somehow found their way deep into the canyon, following what must have seemed like good grass, but had led them into a natural trap. The walls were steep and rocky, the path narrow and winding. On foot, it would take hours to reach the cattle and drive them out. "What about pack animals?" Beckett asked. "If we need to carry water and equipment?" Miguel shook his head. "The path is too narrow for horses with pack loads. Too dangerous." They were still discussing options when Chispa appeared, following his usual habit of investigating any gathering of humans. The donkey surveyed the canyon with apparent interest, his large ears swiveling to catch sounds from below. Carlos, who had developed a particular fondness for Chispa, spoke up hesitantly. "Senor Beckett, maybe we could try the donkey? He is smaller than the horses, and he seems very sure-footed." Beckett's first instinct was to reject the suggestion. Using Chispa for actual ranch work would be admitting that the animal had value beyond his role as an expensive mistake. But the practical part of his mind recognized the logic of the proposal. "He's never been in a canyon," Beckett said. "We don't know how he'll react. Only one way to find out," Miguel observed pragmatically. They fitted Chispa with a worn leather saddlebag that had belonged to the previous owner of the ranch. Practical gear that had seen years of hard use, but remained sturdy and reliable. The bag was a far cry from the elaborate pack equipment that adorned Beckett's show horses, but it suited Chispa perfectly. To everyone's surprise, the donkey navigated the canyon path as if he had been born to it. Where the men had to pick their way carefully over loose rocks and around tight corners, Chispa moved with confident precision. His small hooves found purchase on surfaces that would have challenged a mountain goat, and his natural balance kept him steady even when the path seemed impossibly narrow. More impressive still was his apparent understanding of the mission. Without direction from the humans, Chispa positioned himself to help drive the cattle toward the canyon mouth. using his smaller size to squeeze into spaces where the larger animals might panic, and his intelligence to anticipate their movements. "I've never seen anything like it," Miguel said as they successfully brought the last steer out of the canyon. "It's like he understood exactly what we needed to do." The success of the canyon rescue marked a turning point in how the ranch hands viewed Chispa. Word spread quickly through the community of practical cattlemen, and while the story of the $50,000 donkey continued to provoke laughter in town, the men who actually worked with livestock began to speak of Chispa with genuine respect. The change in perception was reinforced a week later when the ranch faced an unusually dry spell. The main well, which had never failed in Beckett's memory, began to run low, and the backup water sources showed signs of similar stress. Finding water became a critical priority. Again, it was Chispa who provided the solution. The donkey began displaying strange behavior, wandering to specific areas of the ranch and pawing at the ground with apparent purpose. When Miguel followed Chispa's lead and dug where the animal indicated, he found water just 6 feet below the surface. "How did he know?" Beckett asked, genuinely puzzled. The answer came from an unexpected source. Jeremiah Holt, an aging prospector who occasionally passed through the area, happened to visit the ranch during this period. When he saw Chispa, his weathered face lit up with recognition. "Well, I'll be damned," the old man said. "That's an Andalusian pack donkey. Haven't seen one of those beauties in 20 years. Beckett felt his attention sharpen. "What do you know about them?" "Finest working animals ever bred," Holt said with enthusiasm. "Spanish developed them specifically for mountain work, carrying supplies to places no horse could reach. They bred them for intelligence, endurance, and what you might call practical sense. A good Andalusian can find water, predict weather changes, and navigate terrain that would kill a regular animal. You're certain that's what he is? Look at the bone structure, the ear set, the way he moves. That's pure Andalusian bloodline. Where did you get him?" Beckett found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining the circumstances of Chispa's arrival. To his surprise, Holt nodded with understanding rather than amusement. "Sounds like somebody knew exactly what they were doing," the prospector said. "Andalusian pack donkeys are worth their weight in gold in the right circumstances. Most people don't recognize their value because they're looking for the wrong things." "What do you mean?" "They're not pretty like your stallions there, and they don't run fast or jump high. But for real work, dangerous, difficult, necessary work, there's no animal in the world more valuable. I've seen them carry loads up mountain paths that would break a horse's neck. I've seen them find water in desert country where men were dying of thirst. I've seen them work for 20 years without missing a day, then live another 10 years in comfortable retirement." That evening, Beckett found himself studying Chispa with new eyes. The donkey was in his paddock, methodically working his way through his dinner, apparently oblivious to the revolution in his owner's understanding. The worn leather saddlebag hung on the fence post, its practical functionality suddenly seeming more appropriate than the elaborate tack he had originally envisioned. As if sensing the scrutiny, Chispa looked up and met Beckett's gaze. For a long moment, man and donkey regarded each other across the fence. There was intelligence in those dark eyes, and something else, a patient willingness to prove his worth when the opportunity arose. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A week later, little Anna Morrison, Jacob Morrison's 6-year-old daughter, wandered away from her family's ranch and became lost in the rough country between the two properties. The child was found by one of Beckett's ranch hands, unconscious and badly injured from a fall, in a ravine too narrow and steep for horses. Without being asked, Chispa was fitted with his saddlebag, now equipped with medical supplies and water. The donkey carried the unconscious child to safety, navigating the treacherous terrain with the care and precision of a trained paramedic. His gentle gait ensured that the injured girl suffered no additional trauma during the rescue. When Jacob Morrison came to thank Beckett for his role in saving Anna's life, he brought something unexpected, a formal apology. "Thomas, I owe you an apology," Morrison said quietly. "I laughed at your donkey and I was wrong to do it. My daughter owes her life to that animal's abilities. I've never seen anything like what he did today." That night, Beckett walked out to Chispa's paddock for the first time since the donkey's arrival. He brought an apple from Maria's kitchen, and Chispa accepted it with dignified appreciation. As Beckett scratched behind the donkey's ears, he found himself speaking aloud for the first time to his unexpected acquisition. "I still don't understand why this happened," he said quietly. "But I'm beginning to think there might be more to you than I realized." Chispa finished his apple and returned to his hay, but not before giving Beckett a look that seemed to say the feeling was mutual. The discovery came by accident, as meaningful discoveries often do. Maria was cleaning out the small storage room behind the kitchen when she found it tucked behind a pile of old grain sacks, a simple wooden cross, hand-carved from what appeared to be mesquite wood, no larger than a man's palm. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with intricate details that spoke of patience and devotion. "Senor Beckett," Maria called, holding the cross carefully in her weathered hands. "I think this was left for you." Beckett examined the artifact closely. The wood was smooth with age and handling, and carved into the base were barely visible initials, E.M. Below that, in even smaller letters, were the words, "Fe en el propósito," faith in purpose. "The old Mexican man," Beckett said suddenly. "The courier who brought Chispa. He must have left this." Maria nodded, studying the cross with obvious reverence. "It is very old, senor. This kind of carving, it takes many years to learn. Whoever made this, he wanted it to mean something." That afternoon, Beckett found himself carrying the cross in his vest pocket as he went about his daily routines. The small wooden artifact seemed to weigh more than its physical mass could account for, as if it carried the accumulated prayers and hopes of generations. His relationship with Chispa had evolved considerably over the past month. What had begun as embarrassed tolerance had transformed into something approaching partnership. Beckett now included the donkey in his daily rounds of the ranch, and Chispa had proven to be an ideal companion for the practical work of managing 15,000 acres of challenging terrain. The donkey's stamina was remarkable. While Beckett's horses required rest and rotation during long working days, Chispa seemed capable of maintaining steady effort from sunrise to sunset without showing signs of fatigue. More impressive still was his growing ability to anticipate Beckett's needs and intentions. When they approached a gate, Chispa would position himself to hold it open. When Beckett needed to examine something closely, the donkey would wait patiently without being tied. He reads you like a book. Miguel observed one afternoon as they watched Chispa automatically move to block a gap in the fence that might allow cattle to escape. "It's like he knows what you're thinking before you do." The comment wasn't far from the truth. Chispa had developed an uncanny ability to predict Beckett's requirements during their daily work. When they rode fence lines, the donkey would slow near areas that needed repair. When they checked cattle, he would alert Beckett to animals that showed signs of illness or injury. Perhaps most surprisingly, Chispa had become something of a calming influence on Beckett's prize horses. The Stallions, initially suspicious of the small interloper, had grown to accept and even seek out his company. When thunderstorms threatened, the horses would cluster near Chispa, who seemed unperturbed by weather that sent million-dollar bloodlines into nervous fits. This ability to predict weather changes had become another of Chispa's valuable skills. The donkey would begin acting restless hours before storms that caught humans by surprise, allowing the ranch hands to secure equipment and move livestock to shelter before the worst weather arrived. The mining operation in Eagles Pass Canyon had expanded significantly over the summer. What had started as a small-scale prospecting venture had grown into a serious excavation, with nearly 30 men working the deep tunnels that followed a promising silver vein into the heart of the mountains. The mine provided steady income for the local community and had brought new business to Silver Creek. But the geological changes concerned Beckett. The mining operation was removing significant amounts of rock and earth from an area that had always been geologically unstable. Recent rains had caused minor slides in several locations, and the old-timers spoke nervously about the increasing frequency of small earthquakes. "Those mountains have been stable for longer than anyone can remember," Miguel said, as they surveyed the mining operation from a ridge overlooking the canyon. "But all that digging, it's changing things. The rock formations, they're not the same as they were." Chispa, who accompanied them on most inspections of the ranch's boundaries, showed unusual agitation near the mining areas. The donkey would refuse to venture close to certain sections of the canyon walls, and his normally calm demeanor would become nervous and alert when they passed the excavation sites. The tensions with neighboring ranchers had also evolved in unexpected ways. While Jacob Morrison had genuinely changed his attitude toward Chispa after the rescue of his daughter, other ranchers continued to view Beckett's expensive donkey as a source of amusement. The story had spread throughout the territory, and Beckett found himself the subject of jokes and commentary wherever cattlemen gathered. "50,000 for a donkey," he overheard one rancher say at the general store. Thomas Beckett finally found an investment that matches his common sense. The comment stung, but Beckett found himself caring less about the opinions of others and more about the practical realities of ranch management. Chispa had proven his value in ways that had nothing to do with prestige or status, and Beckett was beginning to understand that true worth might not always be reflected in price or appearance. Maria, with her gift for seeing beneath surface appearances, had noticed the changes in her employer's attitude. "You are different now, Signor," she told him one evening as they watched Chispa graze peacefully in the paddock. "More peaceful. Less angry at the world." "I'm not sure I know what you mean," Beckett replied, though he suspected he did. "Before Chispa came, you were always fighting something, fighting to prove yourself, fighting to show everyone how successful you were. Now you just do the work and let the work speak for itself." It was an astute observation. Beckett had spent most of his adult life trying to prove that a poor boy could become the equal of anyone through sheer determination and accumulation of wealth. The pursuit of status symbols had been as much about demonstrating his worth to others as about satisfying his own desires. But working daily with Chispa had taught him something different about value and worth. The donkey didn't care about Beckett's wealth or status. Chispa responded to fairness, consistency, and practical competence. In the donkey's world, a man was judged by his actions and character, not by his possessions or reputation. The wooden cross in Beckett's pocket seemed to grow heavier as these thoughts occupied his mind. Faith in purpose. The old courier's words came back to him regularly. Perhaps the purpose had never been to own the most magnificent horse in Nevada. Perhaps the purpose was something else entirely, something he was only beginning to understand. As autumn approached, the geological instability in Eagles Pass Canyon became more pronounced. Small rockfalls occurred with increasing frequency, and the miners reported strange sounds from deep within the mountain, groaning and shifting, noises that suggested tremendous forces at work. Beneath the surface Chispa's agitation near the mining areas grew more pronounced as well. The donkey would refuse to approach certain sections of the canyon entirely, and his usual calm demeanor would give way to obvious nervousness when they rode the boundary lines near the excavation. "He knows something," Miguel said one afternoon as they watched Chispa back away from a section of canyon wall that looked perfectly stable to human eyes. "Animals, they feel things we cannot." That night, as Beckett lay in bed listening to the wind whistle through the canyon passes, he found himself wondering if Chispa's instincts were trying to warn them about something more serious than routine geological shifting. The wooden cross seemed warm in his hand as he prayed for the first time in years, not for success or wealth, but for wisdom to understand the purpose that had brought an unexpected teacher into his life. The mining equipment manifest arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the same freight company that brought supplies to Eagles Pass Canyon twice weekly. Beckett signed for the document without paying much attention to its contents. Drilling equipment, Support timbers, black powder, rope, and various tools needed to extract silver from increasingly deep tunnels. The list would later prove crucial, but at the time it seemed like routine paperwork. His focus that morning was on Chispa, who had demonstrated yet another unexpected skill during the previous day's work. While herding cattle through a particularly difficult section of rocky terrain, the donkey had somehow managed to anticipate and prevent a potential stampede by positioning himself at exactly the right moment to redirect the lead steer away from a cliff edge. "I've been working cattle for 30 years, Miguel had said afterward, "and I've never seen an animal read a situation like that." But not everyone appreciated Chispa's growing reputation. Sam Fletcher, Beckett's longtime foreman for the Northern Range, had become increasingly critical of what he saw as his employer's misplaced priorities. "Mr. Beckett, with respect, you're spending too much time with that donkey," Fletcher said bluntly as they reviewed the week's work. "The men are starting to think you care more about that animal than about running this ranch properly." Fletcher was a competent cattleman who had worked for Beckett for 5 years, but he represented the old school of ranching that measured everything by traditional standards. In his view, a donkey, regardless of price, was beneath the attention of a serious rancher. "Chispa has proven his value," Beckett replied carefully. "He's helped solve problems that our horses couldn't handle." "That's not the point, sir. It's about appearances. When word gets around that Thomas Beckett is personally training a donkey, it makes the whole operation look unprofessional." The conversation was interrupted by Carlos, who burst into the barn with urgent news. "Senor Beckett, there's been an accident at Miller's Creek. A flash flood caught some children playing near the water. The late summer rains had been sporadic but intense, causing sudden runoffs in the normally dry creek beds. Miller's Creek, which ran along the eastern boundary of Beckett's property, was particularly treacherous during these flash floods because of the steep canyon walls that channeled water with devastating force. When they reached the scene, they found a crowd of frantic adults and one terrified child clinging to a boulder in the middle of the raging creek. The child was Bobby Patterson, the 8-year-old son of a local shopkeeper, who had been swept downstream when the water rose without warning. "We've tried throwing ropes," someone called out, "but the current's too strong, and he's too scared to grab them." The creek was perhaps 30 feet wide at this point, but the water was moving with tremendous force, carrying debris that made any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. Several men had attempted to reach the child on horseback, but the horses were spooked by the rushing water and unstable footing. Without being asked, Chispa stepped forward and studied the situation with obvious intelligence. The donkey seemed to understand both the urgency of the situation and the specific challenges it presented. After a moment of apparent calculation, he began picking his way carefully into the creek. "What's he doing?" Fletcher demanded. But Beckett was already beginning to understand. Chispa's approach was methodical and brilliant. Instead of fighting the current directly, he used his smaller size and superior balance to navigate from boulder to boulder, letting the water flow around him rather than trying to power through it. His sure-footed progress across the treacherous terrain was mesmerizing to watch. When he reached Bobby Patterson, Chispa positioned himself downstream from the boulder, creating a stable platform for the boy to climb onto his back. The rescue took less than 5 minutes from start to finish, but those minutes felt like hours to the watching crowd. The community's response to this latest demonstration of Chispa's abilities marked a definitive shift in public perception. The story spread quickly through Silver Creek and the surrounding ranches, and for the first time, the focus was on the donkey's heroism rather than his cost. "That animal saved my boy's life," Bob Patterson told anyone who would listen. "I don't care what Thomas Beckett paid for him. He's worth every penny." The rescue also provided Beckett with his first opportunity to publicly defend his unusual acquisition. At the monthly Cattlemen's Association meeting, when ranch owner Howard Mills made yet another joke about Beckett's $50,000 jackass, Beckett stood up to respond. "Howard, you can joke about the price all you want," Beckett said calmly, But that donkey has saved 2 children's lives, found water during a drought, and solved problems that million-dollar horses couldn't handle. Maybe it's time we started measuring value by results instead of appearances." The room fell silent. It was the first time Beckett had publicly acknowledged Chispa's worth, and the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Several ranchers nodded in agreement, and even Mills looked embarrassed by his comment. Jeremiah Holt, the old prospector, had become a regular visitor to the ranch over the past month. His knowledge of Andalusian donkeys had proven invaluable, but more importantly, his perspective on life and success had given Beckett much to consider. Most people spend their whole lives chasing after things that look impressive, Holt said one evening as they watched Chispa work with the ranch hands. They want the biggest, the fastest, the most expensive. But real value, the kind that matters when trouble comes, that's usually found in the most unexpected places. You think the courier knew what he was doing when he brought Chispa here? I think that old man understood something about you that you didn't understand about yourself, Holt replied. He saw a successful man who had forgotten the difference between price and value. Chispa was never about what you paid for him. He was about what you needed to learn. The geological instability in Eagles Pass Canyon had become increasingly obvious as autumn progressed. The mining equipment manifest that Beckett had signed for weeks earlier had become a source of concern rather than routine business. The miners were requesting heavier support timbers and more black powder to deal with increasingly unstable rock formations. Chispa's behavior near the canyon had grown more agitated with each passing day. The donkey would refuse to approach within a quarter-mile of the mining operation, and his usual calm demeanor would give way to obvious distress when the wind carried sounds from the excavation. "He's trying to tell us something," Miguel said, as they watched Chispa back away from the canyon overlook. "Every instinct that animal has is saying there's danger in those mountains." The signs were becoming impossible to ignore. Small rockfalls occurred daily now, and the miners reported that the tunnels echoed with strange sounds, groaning and shifting noises that suggested massive geological pressures building toward some kind of release. But the silver vein was rich, and the mining company was reluctant to halt operations based on what they considered superstition and animal instinct. The manifest of equipment continued to grow longer each week, as if more powerful tools could somehow prevent the mountains from following their own ancient patterns. Beckett found himself checking the wooden cross in his pocket more frequently, running his thumb over the carved words, "Faith in purpose." Whatever that purpose might be, he sensed it was approaching faster than anyone realized. The emergency bell began ringing at 3:47 in the afternoon on a crisp October day that had started like any other. The bell, mounted on a tall pole near the entrance to Eagles Pass Canyon, was designed to summon help in case of mining accidents. Its urgent clanging alarm could be heard for miles across the desert, and every rancher and townsperson in the area knew what it meant. Men were in mortal danger deep beneath the mountains. Beckett was checking fence lines in the south pasture when the sound reached him. He immediately abandoned his work and spurred his horse toward the canyon, his heart racing with a mixture of dread and determination. Behind him, he could see dust clouds rising from other parts of the ranch as Miguel and the hands responded to the alarm. By the time he reached the mining operation, a crowd had already gathered around the mouth of the main tunnel. The scene was one of controlled chaos, miners covered in rock dust, supervisors shouting orders, and wives and children from Silver Creek arriving to learn the fate of their men. Tom Bradley, the mine superintendent, was a compact, weathered man who had spent 20 years extracting precious metals from dangerous places. The expression on his face told Beckett everything he needed to know about the severity of the situation. "How bad?" Beckett asked without preamble. "Bad as it gets," Bradley replied grimly. "The whole eastern section came down about an hour ago. We've got 9 men trapped behind God knows how many tons of rock, and the tunnel structure is so damaged that we can't use the main passages to reach them. Are they alive?" "We think so." We can hear tapping from deep inside, and we've been tapping back. But the air situation is critical, and we have no way to get supplies to them. Beckett studied the collapsed tunnel entrance, trying to understand the scope of the disaster. The landslide had been massive. Thousands of tons of rock and earth had shifted, not only blocking the main tunnel, but fundamentally altering the entire geography of the canyon floor. What about digging from above? Someone suggested. Bradley shook his head. The overhang is too unstable. Any heavy digging might bring down more rock and kill everyone inside. We need to find a way to reach them through the existing passages, but most of the tunnels are blocked or too dangerous to navigate. As the afternoon wore on, the rescue efforts became increasingly desperate. Mining experts arrived from surrounding areas, but each assessment of the situation yielded the same conclusion. The traditional rescue methods were impossible, given the extent of the collapse and the instability of the remaining structure. There's one possibility, said Henry Crenshaw, an experienced mine engineer who had arrived from Virginia City. There's a narrow service tunnel that runs parallel to the main excavation. It's only about 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, barely big enough for a man to crawl through. The problem is that it's partially collapsed, and there are sections where the ceiling has dropped so low that even crawling is impossible. Could we widen it? Bradley asked. Not without risking another collapse. And even if we could, the passage is over half a mile long, with turns and obstacles that would make it nearly impossible to carry supplies. A man might be able to squeeze through empty-handed, but he couldn't carry enough water and food to make a difference. The crowd fell silent as the implications sank in. 9 men were trapped with limited air and no supplies, and the only possible route to reach them was too narrow for effective rescue operations. It was Carlos who first voiced what several people were beginning to think. What about pack animals? Something small enough to fit through the passages but strong enough to carry supplies? The passages are too narrow for horses or mules, Crenshaw replied, and too dangerous for any animal valuable enough to risk. The word valuable hung in the air like a challenge. Beckett felt every eye in the crowd turn toward him as the same thought occurred to multiple people simultaneously. There was one animal in the area small enough to navigate impossibly narrow passages, sure-footed enough to handle treacherous terrain, and intelligent enough to work independently in dangerous conditions. Chispa, Miguel said quietly, giving voice to what everyone was thinking. Beckett felt his stomach tighten as he realized the full implications of the suggestion. The donkey that had been the source of his greatest embarrassment might now be the only hope for saving 9 human lives. The animal he had tried to hide from public view was suddenly the most important creature in the entire territory. It's too dangerous, he said, though even as he spoke he knew the objection was meaningless. If there was any chance that Chispa could save those men, the risk had to be taken. Senor Beckett, Bradley said carefully, I know that donkey cost you a considerable sum. No one would expect you to risk him in a situation like this. The comment struck Beckett like a physical blow. It was his opportunity to refuse, to protect his expensive investment and avoid risking Chispa's life for the sake of men he barely knew. The old Thomas Beckett, the man who measured everything by cost and appearance, would have found a dozen reasons why such a mission was impossible. But as he looked around the crowd of desperate faces, at the wives and children whose men were trapped beneath tons of rock, Beckett realized that everything he had learned over the past months had been preparing him for this moment. The wooden cross in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest as the old courier's words echoed in his mind. What you wanted was strength. What you got is stronger. How quickly can we assess the passages? Beckett asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Crenshaw looked surprised by the question. You're seriously considering this? I'm seriously considering saving those men's lives. How long would it take Chispa to reach them if the passages are navigable? If, and it's a big if, the donkey could make it through the collapsed sections, he could reach the trapped area in perhaps 2 hours. But Mr. Beckett, there's no guarantee he could get back out, and there's no way to communicate with him once he enters the tunnels. You could lose both the animal and any supplies he's carrying. Beckett thought about Chispa's intelligence, his uncanny ability to navigate difficult terrain, and his strange sixth sense about dangerous situations. If any animal could survive the mission, it would be the Andalusian donkey, who had been bred for exactly this kind of work. "We need to check the passages first," he said finally. "If there's a reasonable chance of success, we attempt the rescue." The crowd stirred with new energy as Bradley organized a team to assess the service tunnel. Using ropes and lanterns, two experienced miners began the dangerous job of mapping the route that Chispa would need to follow. While they worked, Beckett walked back to his ranch to prepare Chispa for what might be the most important mission of both their lives. The donkey was grazing peacefully in his paddock, apparently unaware that he was about to become either a hero or a victim of the mountain's ancient fury. As Beckett approached the fence, Chispa looked up with his usual calm intelligence. The animal seemed to sense that something significant was happening, but showed no signs of fear or agitation. If anything, he appeared ready for whatever challenge lay ahead. "Well, old friend," Beckett said quietly, scratching behind Chispa's ears, "it looks like it's time to find out what you're really worth." The emergency bell continued to ring in the distance, its urgent rhythm marking the passage of precious time. 9 men were counting on a $50,000 donkey to save their lives, and Thomas Beckett was about to discover whether his most embarrassing investment would prove to be his greatest triumph. The assessment of the service tunnel took 3 hours that felt like 3 days. While the miners worked their way through the collapsed passages, mapping obstacles and measuring clearances, the crowd around the mine entrance grew larger and more desperate. Word had spread throughout the territory, and people arrived from as far as Virginia City to witness what everyone understood might be the only chance to save 9 trapped men. When the assessment team finally emerged, their faces were grim, but not hopeless. Henry Crenshaw delivered the report with professional precision, though his voice carried the weight of lives hanging in the balance. "The passage is navigable, but barely," he announced to the gathered crowd. "There are 3 sections where the ceiling has collapsed to less than 30 inches high. The footing is treacherous throughout, with loose rock that could shift without warning. There are 2 places where the tunnel makes sharp turns that would challenge even a small animal's ability to maneuver. But it can be done?" Beckett asked. "It might be done by the right animal carrying the right equipment, with a considerable amount of luck." Crenshaw paused, studying Beckett's face. "Mr. Beckett, I want to be absolutely clear about what we're asking. This is not a routine rescue operation. The chances of success are perhaps 50% at best, and the chances of losing the animal are equally high." Beckett nodded, though his heart was racing. What would Chispa need to carry? "Water is the most critical need. The trapped men have been without fresh water for over 4 hours now. Food is secondary but important for maintaining their strength. We also need to send down rope and basic medical supplies in case there are injuries." Tom Bradley stepped forward with a canvas bag that had been hastily assembled. "This contains 2 gallons of water in metal canteens, enough hardtack and dried meat for 9 men for 2 days, 50 feet of rope, and basic medical supplies. Total weight is about 40 pounds. It was a substantial load for any animal, but Beckett knew that Chispa had carried similar weights during their daily ranch work. The difference was that those loads had been carried over familiar terrain in good conditions. Not through collapsed mine tunnels in a race against time. "We'll need specialized equipment," Beckett said, his mind moving through the practical challenges. "Something designed specifically for this mission." What followed was perhaps the most focused, collaborative effort Silver Creek had ever seen. Juan Martinez, the town's finest leather worker, began crafting a custom harness designed to distribute weight evenly while allowing Chispa maximum flexibility in tight spaces. The harness would need to protect the donkey from sharp rocks while ensuring that the supply bags wouldn't catch on obstacles or shift during the dangerous journey. Meanwhile, the town's blacksmith, aided by several miners with expertise in underground operations, modified the supply containers to minimize their profile while maximizing their capacity. Every ounce mattered, and every inch of clearance could mean the difference between success and failure. As the equipment took shape, Beckett found himself surrounded by people offering advice, encouragement, and prayers. The transformation in how the community viewed both him and Chispa was remarkable. The expensive mistake had become their collective hope, and the man who had been mocked for his foolish investment was now seen as the potential savior of 9 lives. "Thomas," Jacob Morrison approached with genuine emotion in his voice, "I want you to know that what you're doing here goes beyond anything I could have imagined. After what Chispa did for my daughter, and now this, I was wrong about both of you." Similar conversations took place throughout the afternoon as neighbors and former critics acknowledged the courage required to risk a $50,000 animal on a rescue mission that might claim his life. But Beckett found that their praise made him uncomfortable rather than proud. This wasn't about proving his worth or silencing his critics. This was about doing what needed to be done because it was right. Maria appeared at his elbow as the sun began to sink toward the western mountains. "Senor, you need to eat something. This will be a long night, and you will need your strength." She had brought a plate of food, but Beckett found he had no appetite. The weight of responsibility was crushing. 9 men were depending on him and Chispa, and their families were watching every decision with desperate hope. "Maria, what if I'm wrong? What if Chispa can't make it through those passages, or gets lost, or—" "Senor," she interrupted gently, "do you remember what the old courier told you? What you wanted was strength, but what you got is stronger. Tonight you will discover what that truly means." As darkness fell, portable lanterns were set up around the mine entrance, casting strange shadows that danced across the crowd of waiting faces. The custom harness was completed and fitted to Chispa, who submitted to the process with his usual patient intelligence. The modified supply bags were attached and tested to ensure they wouldn't shift or catch during the journey. Jeremiah Holt, the old prospector, examined the equipment with an expert eye. "This is fine work," he told Beckett. "As good as anything I've seen in 40 years of mountain country. If any animal can make this journey, it's your Andalusian. You really think he can do it? I think that donkey was bred for exactly this kind of work. His ancestors carried supplies through mountain passes that would kill most animals. But more than that, I think he understands what's expected of him. Look at his eyes. He knows this is important." It was true. Chispa stood calmly in his rescue harness, but there was an alertness in his posture that suggested he understood the gravity of the situation. When Beckett approached, the donkey turned his head and looked directly into his owner's eyes, with an expression that seemed to convey both readiness and reassurance. "We need to make our final approach to the tunnel entrance," Crenshaw announced. "The longer we wait, the more critical the situation becomes for the trapped men." The crowd followed in solemn procession as Beckett led Chispa toward the mouth of the service tunnel. The entrance was barely visible, a narrow opening that had been cleared of debris but still looked impossibly small for any meaningful rescue operation. Beckett knelt beside the tunnel entrance and called into the darkness. "Hello? Can you hear me?" Faint tapping sounds came back, the code that miners used to communicate through rock. 3 taps meant, "We hear you." The responding taps were weak but clearly audible. "We're sending help," Beckett called. "Stay strong." The final preparations took another hour. Lanterns were positioned to provide light as far into the tunnel as possible. Ropes were attached to the supply bags so that they could be recovered if Chispa encountered an impassable obstacle. Emergency plans were discussed for every contingency anyone could imagine. As the moment of departure approached, Beckett asked for a few minutes alone with Chispa. The crowd respectfully withdrew, leaving man and donkey facing the entrance to what might be their greatest challenge. "I don't know if you understand what I'm asking you to do," Beckett said quietly, stroking Chispa's neck. "Those men down there are counting on us. Their families are counting on us. I'm asking you to go into a dark, dangerous place where I can't follow and trust that you'll find your way back to me." Chispa nuzzled against Beckett's shoulder in a gesture that seemed to acknowledge both the danger and the necessity of the mission. In that moment, Beckett finally understood what the old courier had meant about strength. It wasn't about size or speed or impressive appearance. It was about the courage to do what needed to be done, regardless of the cost or risk. "I was wrong about you," Beckett whispered. "I was wrong about what makes something valuable. You're not just the most expensive donkey in Nevada, you're the most important animal I've ever known." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the wooden cross that had been carved by hands he would never know. The words carved into its base, "Faith in Purpose," seemed to glow in the lantern light. For the first time in years, Thomas Beckett prayed with complete sincerity, asking not for wealth or success or recognition, but for the safety of 9 trapped men and the small, brave animal who was their only hope. "Please," he whispered to whatever power might be listening, "let us be worthy of this trust." Chispa stood perfectly still as Beckett made the final adjustments to his harness and supply bags. The donkey's calm confidence seemed to flow into the man, steadying his nerves and strengthening his resolve. The tunnel entrance yawned before them like the mouth of some ancient beast, dark and forbidding and full of unknown dangers. But Chispa showed no fear as he approached the opening. Instead, he turned back one last time to look at Beckett, as if memorizing the face of the man who had learned to value him. Then, with steady steps that spoke of absolute determination, Chispa entered the darkness and began the most important journey of his life. The first 100 yards of the service tunnel were the easiest, though easy was a relative term when applied to a passage barely 3 feet high, with jagged rock formations jutting from every surface. Chispa moved with deliberate care, his specially designed harness protecting him from the worst of the sharp edges while allowing him the flexibility to navigate the increasingly difficult terrain. A miner's lamp had been attached to his harness, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on the tunnel walls and creating an otherworldly atmosphere in the narrow passage. The lamp served a dual purpose, providing essential illumination for Chispa's navigation, while also serving as a beacon of hope for the men trapped somewhere in the darkness ahead. Above ground, Beckett paced anxiously near the tunnel entrance, listening for any sounds that might indicate progress or trouble. The crowd had grown silent, understanding that noise might interfere with the delicate communication system they had established. Every few minutes, someone would call into the tunnel and listen for responding sounds, either from Chispa or from the trapped miners. 20 minutes after Chispa had disappeared into the darkness, they heard the first encouraging sound, a faint braying that indicated the donkey was still moving forward and had encountered some kind of obstacle or landmark. The sound was followed by scraping noises that suggested he was working his way around or through a particularly challenging section. "He's reached the first collapsed area," Crenshaw announced, consulting the rough map they had drawn of the tunnel system. "That's good progress, but the worst is still ahead." Inside the tunnel, Chispa was discovering just how accurate that assessment was. The passage had narrowed to less than 2.5 feet in height, forcing him to move in an awkward crouch that put tremendous strain on his back and legs. Loose rocks shifted under his hooves with every step, and more than once he had to back up and find an alternative route around obstacles that hadn't been visible from a distance. But the Andalusian breeding that had produced generations of sure-footed mountain animals served Chispa well in these conditions. His natural balance and instinctive understanding of weight distribution allowed him to navigate surfaces that would have challenged even experienced human climbers. When loose rocks threatened to give way beneath him, he redistributed his weight with lightning-fast adjustments that prevented potentially catastrophic falls. The miner's lamp on his harness revealed the tunnel ahead in brief, terrifying glimpses. Sections where the ceiling had partially collapsed created natural obstacles that required careful maneuvering. Sharp turns that had been manageable for human miners became complex geometric puzzles for an animal carrying supplies through impossibly tight spaces. After 40 minutes of steady progress, Chispa encountered the most challenging obstacle yet, a section where the tunnel ceiling had dropped to less than 2 feet high, creating a passage that seemed impossible for any animal larger than a large dog. The gap extended for perhaps 20 feet before opening up again, but those 20 feet might as well have been 20 miles if they couldn't be navigated. For several minutes, Chispa studied the obstacle with obvious intelligence. He approached from different angles, testing the stability of the rocks and assessing the available clearance. Then, with a decision that demonstrated remarkable problem-solving ability, he began to work his way through the gap on his belly, using his powerful hindquarters to push himself forward while keeping his head low to avoid the crushing weight of unstable rock above. The process was agonizingly slow and dangerous. Every movement had to be calculated to avoid dislodging rocks that could trap him permanently or crush the vital supplies he carried. But inch by inch, foot by foot, Chispa worked his way through the impossibly narrow passage until he finally emerged into a section of tunnel that offered slightly more clearance. Above ground, the waiting crowd had fallen into an anxious silence, broken only by periodic calls into the tunnel and the faint responses that indicated continued progress. Beckett found himself checking his pocket watch compulsively, calculating the time elapsed against the estimated survival time for the trapped miners. "He's been down there over an hour," Bradley said quietly. "Even if everything goes perfectly, he's still got at least another hour before he reaches the trapped area." The comment highlighted the cruel mathematics of the rescue operation. Every minute that passed reduced the chances of finding the miners alive. But there was no way to accelerate Chispa's progress without risking the mission entirely. At precisely 1 hour and 23 minutes after entering the tunnel, they heard a sound that made everyone's heart leap. Human voices, faint but unmistakable, coming from deep within the mountain. The trapped miners had made contact with their unlikely rescuer. "Water!" The word echoed up through the passages, distorted by distance and rock, but clearly audible. "Thank God, water!" For the first time since the emergency bell had begun ringing, the crowd around the mine entrance allowed themselves to hope. Chispa had succeeded in reaching the trapped men and delivering the supplies that might keep them alive. But as celebratory as the moment was, everyone understood that the mission was only half complete. The donkey still had to make the return journey through the same treacherous passages, and they would need multiple trips to extract all 9 miners from their underground prison. The race against time and unstable geology had only just begun. The return journey proved even more treacherous than the descent. Chispa emerged from the tunnel after 2 hours and 47 minutes underground. His coat darkened with sweat, and his breathing labored, but his eyes still bright with determination. The empty supply bags hanging from his harness told the story of successful delivery, but everyone understood that this was merely the beginning of a marathon rescue operation. How many more trips? Beckett asked Crenshaw as they quickly refitted Chispa with fresh supplies. "At least 4, maybe 5. We need to get enough food and water down there to sustain 9 men while we figure out how to extract them. And we need to send down mining equipment so they can begin clearing debris from their end." What followed was the longest night in Silver Creek's history. Trip after trip, Chispa descended into the darkness, carrying supplies that grew more specialized with each journey. Tools for digging, additional rope, medical supplies for treating the injuries that several miners had sustained in the initial collapse. Each load was carefully calculated to maximize the chances of survival while fitting through the impossibly narrow passages. By the 4th trip, Chispa was showing signs of serious exhaustion. His movements were slower, his breathing more labored, and his usual confident stride had become a careful, measured pace that spoke of an animal pushing himself beyond normal limits. But each time Beckett suggested postponing the next trip, circumstances underground would change in ways that demanded immediate action. "One of the miners is hurt worse than we thought," came the message through the rock-tapping communication system. "We need medical supplies immediately, or we might lose him." It was near dawn when the most dangerous moment of the entire rescue arrived. The geological instability that had caused the original collapse was worsening, and the service tunnel itself was beginning to show signs of potential failure. Loose rocks were falling more frequently, and ominous groaning sounds suggested that massive structural changes were taking place within the mountain. "This has to be the last trip," Crenshaw told Beckett bluntly. "The tunnel won't survive much longer, and we can't risk losing the only route to those men." The final load was the most critical. Specialized digging equipment that would allow the trapped miners to begin working from their end to clear a larger passage that might eventually allow human rescuers to reach them. But it was also the heaviest and most awkward load Chispa had carried, and the tunnel conditions were deteriorating with each passing hour. Beckett knelt beside Chispa before the final descent, looking into the donkey's exhausted but resolute eyes. "I know you're tired," he said quietly. "I know this is asking everything you have to give, but those men are counting on us one more time." Chispa nuzzled against Beckett's shoulder in a gesture that had become their private communication. Then, with the same steady determination he had shown throughout the night, he entered the tunnel for what both man and donkey understood would be the most dangerous journey yet. This time, the waiting was agonizing. Sounds of shifting rock echoed from within the mountain, and twice they heard distant rumbles that suggested major geological movements. When 40 minutes passed without any communication from below, several people began to fear the worst. Then, faintly but clearly, came the sound they had been hoping for: human voices singing. The trapped miners, revived by food and water and armed with the tools they needed to begin their own rescue efforts, were celebrating the arrival of their final supplies. But Chispa's return journey became a race against total tunnel collapse. Rocks fell continuously now, and the passage was narrowing in several places as the mountain settled into new configurations. When the donkey finally emerged from the tunnel for the last time, he was covered in rock dust and moving with obvious pain. But he carried something that made the entire night worthwhile: a simple gold wedding ring tied to his harness with a piece of string. "From Jimmy Patterson," called one of the miners through the rock communication system. "He wants his wife to know he's alive and thinking of her." The crowd that had maintained its vigil throughout the night erupted in cheers that could be heard for miles. But for Beckett, the moment was intensely personal. As he removed the wedding ring from Chispa's harness, he realized that everything he had ever thought about value and worth had been fundamentally wrong. This animal, whom he had once considered an embarrassment, had just completed one of the most heroic rescue operations in mining history. The $50,000 he had paid seemed meaningless compared to the 9 lives that had been saved and the families that would be reunited. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom Bradley announced to the crowd, "I want you all to witness something remarkable. This donkey, Chispa, has just accomplished what no horse in the world could have done. He has saved 9 men's lives through courage, intelligence, and determination that goes beyond anything I've seen in 40 years of mining." As the sun rose over the Silver Creek Mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Beckett stood beside Chispa and felt a transformation that had nothing to do with public recognition or vindication of his investment. He had learned the difference between price and value, between appearance and substance, between what a man wants and what he truly needs. The mockery that had followed Chispa's arrival was replaced by universal respect and admiration. The expensive mistake had become the greatest hero Silver Creek had ever known. 3 months later, the bronze plaque was unveiled in Silver Creek's town square, with a ceremony that drew visitors from across Nevada and beyond. The inscription was simple but profound, in honor of Chispa and true strength, when courage matters more than cost, and character counts more than breeding. Below those words was the date of the rescue and a list of the 9 miners whose lives had been saved by an unlikely hero. Thomas Beckett stood, with his hand resting on Chispa's. neck as the mayor pulled away the cloth covering the memorial. The donkey, now the most famous animal in the territory, accepted the attention with his usual dignified calm. Though Beckett noticed, he seemed more interested in the children, who had gathered to see him, than in the formal speeches being delivered in his honor. The transformation in how the community viewed both Chispa and his owner had been as dramatic as it was complete. Where once there had been mockery and jokes about Beckett's expensive mistake, there was now genuine respect for both the man's wisdom and the animal's extraordinary abilities. Visitors came from hundreds of miles away just to see the donkey who'd accomplished what no horse could have done. But for Beckett, the external recognition mattered far less than the internal changes that had taken place over the past months. The rescue had marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in how he understood success, value, and what it meant to live a meaningful life. "You know," he said to Jacob Morrison as they watched Chispa interact with a group of children after the ceremony, "I spent most of my adult life trying to prove I was worth something by accumulating things that looked impressive. The biggest ranch, the finest horses, the most expensive everything. I thought that's what strength meant." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. They had become genuine friends since the rescue, their old rivalry replaced by mutual respect and shared understanding of what truly mattered. "Oh, what changed your mind?" Beckett reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the wooden cross that he now carried everywhere. The carved words, "Faith in Purpose," had become his daily reminder of lessons learned through unexpected teachers. "I realized I was measuring strength by all the wrong standards. Real strength isn't about overpowering others or displaying superiority. It's about having the courage to do what needs to be done, regardless of what people think or what it costs you personally." The lesson had been reinforced countless times since the rescue. Chispa had continued to prove his worth in ways that had nothing to do with drama or crisis. He had become an integral part of ranch operations, solving problems that Beckett's expensive stallions couldn't handle, and demonstrating daily that practical wisdom often trumped impressive appearances. More importantly, the donkey had taught Beckett about humility and service. Where the stallions demanded attention and careful handling, Chispa simply did whatever work was required, with steady competence and without complaint. He had shown Beckett that true nobility came not from bloodlines or cost, but from character and dedication to purpose. The changes in Beckett's perspective had affected every aspect of his life. He now measured his ranch hands' value by their work ethic and loyalty, rather than their appearance or background. He had begun investing in practical improvements to the ranch, rather than showy additions designed to impress visitors. Most significantly, he had started mentoring young ranchers, sharing what he had learned about the difference between price and value. "There's a young man down in Carson City," Beckett told Morrison as they walked away from the ceremony. "Reminds me of myself 20 years ago, all ambition and no wisdom. He's been asking my advice about horse breeding, wanting to know how to make the most expensive purchases. I'm going to tell him about Chispa. Think he'll listen? Probably not immediately. Pride has a way of making us deaf to the most important lessons. But maybe when he's ready to hear them, he'll remember what I told him about a $50,000 donkey who taught a stubborn rancher about true strength." The relationship between Beckett and Chispa had evolved into something deeper than ownership or even partnership. They had become companions who understood each other with a completeness that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal. Chispa seemed to anticipate Beckett's needs and moods with uncanny accuracy, while Beckett had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated the donkey's thoughts and intentions. Maria, watching their interaction with her usual perceptive wisdom, had once observed that they had become like an old married couple who could communicate volumes with a glance or gesture. The comment had made Beckett laugh, but he recognized its truth. Chispa had become more than a working animal. He was a trusted friend whose presence brought both practical benefits and emotional comfort as the sun set behind the mountains that had witnessed their greatest triumph. Beckett stood in his paddock with Chispa, reflecting on the journey that had brought them both so far from where they had started. The simple rope halter that still hung on the fence post served as a daily reminder of how dramatically his values had changed. The old courier's words echoed in his memory one final time. "What you wanted was strength. What you got is stronger." Now, finally, Beckett understood the complete truth of that statement. He had wanted an impressive horse that would demonstrate his success and silence his critics. Instead, he had received a teacher who had shown him that the greatest strength came not from overwhelming others, but from serving a purpose larger than oneself. The bronze plaque in the town square would preserve the story of their rescue mission for future generations. But the real memorial to Chispa's impact was written in the transformed heart of a man who had learned to measure worth by wisdom rather than cost, strength by character rather than appearance, and success by service rather than status. Sometimes the greatest investments come disguised as the most expensive mistakes. And sometimes wisdom arrives on 4 humble hooves when we least expect it and most desperately need it.